At -25 degrees Celsius, the Rocky Mountains cease to be a landscape and become a kinetic weapon. In a true whiteout, the inner ear loses its connection to gravity. The brain, deprived of a horizon line, begins to hallucinate movement. But the real danger is the metabolic clock. When the human core temperature drops below 35 degrees, the body enters a state of clinical hypothermia. Shivering, the body's last-ditch effort to generate kinetic heat, eventually fails. Blood vessels in the extremities constrict in a process called vasoconstriction, pulling every drop of warmth toward the heart and brain. In these conditions, a person loses the ability to perform complex motor tasks, like zipping a jacket, in under 20 minutes. Without shelter, the transition from exhaustion to a fatal cardiac event is a matter of a few hundred heartbeats. Daniel Mercer moves through this chaos not by sight, but by memory and the calibrated tension of a safety line. For 20 years, he served as a volunteer rescue lead, training his body to operate when the nervous system wants to shut down. He is out checking the stability of the local snowpack, looking for a buried air pocket, when he sees a flash of Gore-Tex that doesn't belong. He finds the hiker face down, her breathing shallow and ragged, the moisture from her lungs already forming a mask of ice over her mouth. Daniel doesn't look for a pulse. He looks for a response to pain. He performs a rapid assessment, checks for spinal trauma, and begins the grueling process of hauling her toward the only sanctuary for 30 miles, his cabin. Inside the cabin, the danger shifts to the victim's own biology. This diagram illustrates a phenomenon Daniel has seen kill more people than the cold itself: afterdrop. In severe hypothermia, the blood in the limbs is significantly colder and more acidic than in the core. If Daniel were to rub her limbs to wake them up, sudden vasodilation would flush toxic, freezing blood straight back to her heart. This acidic slug can trigger ventricular fibrillation, leading to instant death. Survival depends on gentle, passive rewarming, focusing heat only on the torso. Daniel methodically wraps her in layers of dry wool, avoiding the limbs. He monitors the clinical indicators of cognitive decline. Surviving the initial exposure is a victory of physics, but the next few hours will be a test of chemistry. Daniel knows that in the backcountry, the rescue is only half the battle. The other half is managing the violent reaction the body has when it finally realizes it isn't going to die. The cabin is a fortress of thick-hewn cedar and stone, designed to withstand the weight of 10 feet of snow. Inside, the roar of the wind is reduced to a low, rhythmic thrum. The air smells of wood smoke and lanolin. Here, the immediate, screaming urgency of the whiteout fades, replaced by the steady, ticking heat of the cast-iron stove. Daniel moves through the small space with the economy of motion typical of a man who has lived alone for a decade. He is no longer a rescuer in a storm. He is a caretaker in a tomb. As the woman's breathing stabilizes, Daniel begins the process of drying her gear. He carefully peels away her frozen outer shell. It is a technical, clinical process until he reaches for the collar of her base layer. There, tangled in the fabric, is a tarnished silver locket on a heavy chain. He doesn't mean to pry, but the clasp is broken, likely snagged during the rescue. As he moves it to a side table, the hinge swings open. The photograph inside is protected by a thin layer of plastic, but the edges are yellowed. It shows a man in his early 30s, grinning against a backdrop of granite and ice. He is wearing a distinctive vintage orange parka with a patch from a defunct climbing club. Daniel freezes. He doesn't need to read a name to know who this is. He remembers the exact shade of that parka. He remembers the way that man looked 15 years ago, right before the sky fell. The woman on his cot is Emily Carter, the daughter of the one man Daniel could never bring home. Daniel sits in the shadows, his hands trembling. For 15 years, he has replayed the logs of that failed mission. He has lived in this remote valley as a self-imposed penance, believing he could somehow balance the scales. Now, the living embodiment of his greatest failure is breathing in his guest bed. The storm outside has intensified, the barometric pressure dropping so low it makes the timbers of the cabin groan. He is trapped. There is no radio contact in this valley during a solar minimum storm, and the snow is already halfway up the windows. Daniel looks at Emily, then at the photograph in the locket. The impenetrable blizzard has done more than just trap two strangers. It has forced a collision between a long-buried secret and the person most likely to be destroyed by it. By the second day, the cabin is almost entirely subsurface. The weight of the snowpack on the roof creates a terrifying silence, broken by the crack of a freezing timber. Keeping the space habitable becomes a full-time job. Daniel has to maintain a constant internal temperature of 18 degrees Celsius, warm enough to prevent Emily from sliding back into hypothermia, but not so hot that it causes the snow on the roof to melt and refreeze into a heavy, structurally threatening ice dam. Water is the primary concern. In a sub-zero environment, the body loses nearly a liter of water a day just through respiration. Daniel fills large pots with clean snow, but the physics of melting are deceptive. Snow is mostly air. It takes 10 pots of powder to produce 1 pot of water. He has to be careful not to scorch the bottom of the pot, which gives the water a metallic, undrinkable taste. This constant cycle of melting and boiling is the only thing keeping their kidneys from failing in the dry, high-altitude air. This diagram shows the most lethal invisible threat in a snow-buried cabin, carbon monoxide. CO molecules bind to hemoglobin 200 times more effectively than oxygen, essentially starving the brain while the victim is still breathing. Because the cabin's external vents are blocked by drifts, Daniel has to use a long pole to clear a chimney flue every 4 hours. He monitors the flame. If it turns from bright orange to a dull, flickering blue, oxygen levels are dropping and CO is pooling. As Emily recovers, she begins to talk. She isn't here on a whim. She tells Daniel about the years she spent in the Pacific Northwest, tracking down the 2 climbers who were rescued during that storm 15 years ago. She explains that they were traumatized, barely able to speak about the event, but they both mentioned a third man, her father, who they claimed stayed with them in the initial hours of the whiteout. Emily has come here to find the exact spot where they were separated, convinced that the official record of her father's disappearance was missing a vital detail. Daniel listens with his back turned, obsessively sharpening a skinning knife. Every detail she reveals is a jagged reminder of the report he signed, a report that focused on the success of the 2 survivors and glossed over the unrecoverable third victim. He feels the survivor's guilt mounting, a physical weight in his chest. He answers her in monosyllables, terrified his voice will betray the fact that he was the one who made the call to stop the search. In the backcountry, the checklist is your anchor. Daniel clings to the survival protocols, ventilation, hydration, wood stacking, because they are the only things keeping his mind from fracturing. But as the storm shows no sign of relenting, he realizes he can't outrun the conversation. The cabin is no longer a sanctuary. It is an interrogation room. On the 3rd evening, the woodpile inside the cabin runs low. While Daniel is in the crawl space checking the structural supports against the snow load, Emily begins searching for extra kindling. She moves toward the back of the cabin, where the shadows are deepest, hoping to find some old newspapers or dry tinder to keep the fire from dying. Tucked behind a stack of wool blankets, she finds an old, weather-beaten footlocker. It isn't locked. Inside, she finds more than just kindling. She finds a leather-bound rescue journal, dozens of topographical maps with hand-drawn annotations, and a stack of newspaper clippings from a decade and a half ago. The headlines are all the same: Tragedy on the Peak, and 2 saved, 1 lost. This map illustrates the triage zones Daniel used during the operation. In search and rescue, triage is a cold mathematical reality. Green zones are low-risk areas, where teams can work indefinitely. Yellow zones have moderate risk, but the red zone, the area where Emily's father was last seen, is a no-go area during active storms. The risk of a secondary slide is near 100%. To send a team there is to trade 5 lives for the slim chance of finding 1. Emily traces the dotted lines on the map. She sees the X marking her father's last known coordinates, buried deep in the red. The line traces backward to a central command point marked with Daniel's initials. The initials match the name on the deed she saw on the cabin wall. Daniel wasn't just a witness. He was the incident commander who drew the line that separated her father from the rescue party. When Daniel climbs back up from the crawl space, he finds Emily holding the journal. The flickering light of the wood stove casts long, jagged shadows against the wall. The physical environment of the cabin, the very walls that saved her life, has now forced a confrontation with the man who, in her eyes, ended her father's. There are no more survival tasks to hide behind. Daniel doesn't try to take the journal. He sits down across from her, the weight of 15 years of silence finally breaking. He begins to speak, his voice rasping from the dry air. He describes the afternoon of the slide, the way the air turned gray, the sound like a freight train screaming through the valley. He describes the impossible pressure of the command tent. He explains the doctrine of wilderness triage. In a mass casualty event, you don't save the person who needs the most help. You save the person who is most likely to survive the transport. It is a logic that ignores screams and focuses entirely on pulse rates and terrain stability. To an outsider, it looks like abandonment. To a rescuer, it is the only way to ensure the entire team doesn't become a second set of victims. This logic tree shows the calculation Daniel made at 4:15 p.m. that day. He had 4 rescuers left who weren't suffering from exhaustion. He had a 90% probability of reaching the 2 climbers on the lower ledge before the secondary storm hit. Emily's father was 2,000 vertical feet higher, in a chute that was actively shedding snow. The probability of reaching him alive was less than 5%. Daniel chose the 90%. He chose the 2. Daniel tells her that he has seen her father's face every time he closes his eyes. He admits that he hated himself for the math. He believed that by choosing the 2, he had personally signed a death warrant for the 1. He tells her he moved to this cabin because he couldn't stand to look at the people in town who called him a hero. This is the central tragedy of the high-altitude rescuer. The very skills that allow you to save lives also force you to see the statistical inevitability of death. Daniel had lived his life as if that mathematical reality was a moral failure, a burden that had slowly eroded his sense of self until there was nothing left but the cabin and the cold. On the 4th morning, the storm finally breaks. The barometric pressure spikes, and the clouds tear open to reveal a sky of piercing crystalline blue. The mountains, which had been an antagonist for 3 days, are suddenly deceptively beautiful. The air is so cold it stings the lungs, but the wind is gone. Daniel leads Emily out of the cabin on snowshoes. They trek through a world that has been completely reshaped by the blizzard. He takes her to a high, wind-swept ridge overlooking the valley. There, bolted into a granite outcropping, is a small brass plate. It marks the spot where the search was officially called off. Emily stands in the silence for a long time. Then she looks at Daniel and tells him what the survivors told her. They didn't just mention a 3rd man who stayed with them. They told her that when the first slide hit, her father wasn't trapped. He was clear of the debris. But instead of climbing down to safety, he went back into the churn to pull the other 2 climbers behind a rock buttress. One of them had a femoral bleed. Emily recounts how the survivors described her father using his own climbing sling as a tourniquet, holding the pressure for 3 hours in the dark until he finally succumbed to exhaustion. Hearing this changes everything for Daniel. He had spent 15 years thinking he had abandoned a victim, but the reality was that her father had already made his own choice. He wasn't a man waiting to be saved. He was a man who had already decided to save others, regardless of the cost. The sacrifice wasn't something Daniel had imposed on him. It was a final, courageous act that her father had chosen for himself. Nature is indifferent to our calculations. It demands impossible choices and offers no apologies. But as Daniel and Emily stand on the ridge, the weight of the past begins to shift. Surviving the mountain is a feat of physics and gear, but surviving the guilt requires something more. The recognition that even in the face of an avalanche, the human spirit is not a victim of the math. It is the one thing the storm cannot bury.